All right, Brian, we can go ahead and get started.
After 3 weeks of saying good afternoon, it's refreshing to wish everyone a good morning and to welcome each of you to the final program of the Chamber RVA Shared Values Summit. For the past 4 weeks, we've welcomed several hundred leaders, influencers, dreamers, and change makers into a series of conversations about our identity as a region and about our aspirations for reinventing the Richmond region as a place where every person can build and thrive. As a newcomer to Richmond, this has been a crash course in Richmond's history and a welcome introduction to the diverse leadership that helps shape our work as we respond together to the huge economic, health, and social challenges of the past year. Today, I'm truly excited because we're going to have two immensely powerful conversations and discussions about systemic change. It's not often that we get to have two presidents of two Federal Reserve banks talk about foundational and systemic work that is needed to build real solutions for economic mobility and growth. We'll follow that discussion with what I know will be an incredibly candid conversation about Richmond's culture of change, what it has been and what it needs to be different if we're truly going to engage and energize the best of who we are as a community. Sit back, take notes, and get ready to be challenged by a handful of talented thinkers and doers. First, though, I'd like to thank our board members participating today and our sponsors. Today's session is made possible through the support of dozens of local organizations, but today I'd specifically like to thank our partners at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, Virginia Commonwealth University, and JMI. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. We'll again be using a tool called Mentimeter to make this experience as dynamic as possible. If you haven't already done so, please open in a separate browser tab or your phone, go to menti.com, MENTI.com, and enter our event code shown on the screen. Please stay muted throughout the program so we can focus on our speakers. And we'll be recording all these series sessions and we'll share them after the series concludes. In WebEx, you, the participant, can control your own view settings, and we advise that you adjust your view to be active speaker for the best experience. And finally, if you have a question, please use the chat function to all panelists, and we'll address these questions during each Q&A. To help get us started today, I'd like to welcome my friend Heidi Krapel from VCU, who will get us started. Welcome, Heidi.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning.
Good morning.
On behalf of VCU Health System, and Dr. Rao, we are proud and honored to support the Chamber today and contribute to this very timely and urgent conversation on economic mobility and inclusive growth in our region. I am Heidi Krapel, and I serve as the Executive Director of the VCU Center for Community Engagement and Impact. As an urban public research university, we understand the transformational power of education as a critical pathway to economic mobility and inclusive growth in our region. As many of you know, we are committed to diversity and inclusion, and we prioritize access to education. And that's truly reflected in our student body and the many faces of first-generation college students, students from our Black and Brown communities, and dreamers on campus. Out of our 23,000 undergraduate students, 1/3 are underrepresented minorities, and 1/3 are Pell Grant eligible, coming from families making less than $50,000 a year. We also recognize that access to education is only the first step. We can get them in the door, but it's important that we work hard to retain them. Our students face many barriers to completion. So attainment is that second part of the equation, and that is why we are laser focused on student success. We take a holistic individual approach to supporting our students all along the way of their educational journey to help them cross that finish line into good paying jobs. The good news is we're making progress. In the face of declining graduation rates across the nation, we've actually increased our student graduation rate 10 points above the national average over the last decade. And importantly, we've increased the 6-year graduation rate for Black, Latinx, and Native American students by more than 15%, closing that equity gap with their white peers. And we are ranked number 56 in the country in conferring the most bachelor degrees to minorities in the nation. We're making progress, but we've got a long way to go and much work remains. And that is why today's conversation is particularly relevant, because research tells us higher education is the cornerstone of economic and social mobility. In the season of gratitude, I thank all of you for being here today, and I'm just sorry I can't see your faces. I want to recognize on behalf of VCU what each of you is doing to promote collaboration, keeping us honest about the hard questions around equity, and leaning into the critical issues around the barriers to economic mobility and inclusive growth in order that we can reach our full potential as a region. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Renee Holtram, the Vice President and Regional Executive of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond.
Thank you, Heidi, and good morning, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here today representing two organizations that I'm passionate about. Chamber RVA, for which I'm on the executive committee. I chair the Futures Committee and serve on the DEI task force, and the Federal Reserve, for which I've worked for 16 years, to introduce the presidents of the Richmond and the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank. So this event is my worlds colliding in the best way. I'm energized to talk about the growing commitment of Chamber RVA to ensure that our business community is moving forward with the nonprofit sector, government and educational leaders, cultural institutions, philanthropists, and grassroots innovators to create a stronger, vibrant, and more inclusive Richmond region. Our first two speakers this morning join us from the Federal Reserve. And the Fed is best known for its role in the overall economy, right? We set interest rates, we supervise banks, and we move payments around within the financial system. And we do this with the goal of supporting a healthy overall economy and financial system. Now, these are pretty big picture functions within the overall economy, but we also care about how outcomes differ across people, whether that's by sector, by geography, or by household characteristics, including race. At the Fed, we have increasingly embraced the idea that we can't truly understand the economy's health unless we are understanding how it is or isn't serving everyone. The Fed also has resources we can directly bring to bear to help our communities through our activities in community and economic development, as well as economic research. And two Fed leaders who have been especially active in understanding and strengthening our communities are Raphael Bostic and Tom Barkin. Some of you may know that the Federal Reserve System is made up of 12 regional reserve banks. Tom Barkin is the president and CEO of the Fed here in Richmond, which serves Virginia, the Carolinas, Maryland, West Virginia, and DC. And Raphael Bostic is the president and CEO of the Atlanta Fed, which covers Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, and portions of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Their bios are available in the promotional materials for this program. We won't read them today in favor of spending more time on the important content. Both Tom and Raphael sit on the Fed committee that sets national interest rates, and both bring lots of insights from their work understanding our communities. Both have had their boots on the ground. In fact, it's hard for me to keep up with Tom in that regard. And with that, it's my pleasure now to turn it over to Tom Barkin, and I'll invite you to please enter your questions along the way for our speakers into the chat box. So Tom, please take it away.
Thanks, Renee, and thanks, Raphael, for making time to be virtually here in Richmond together. A couple other parts Renee didn't say in the introduction is Raphael and I actually went to college together. And we've spent a lot of time together since talking about two districts in the South and many things they have in common. So I think this will be an interesting conversation, and Raphael brings a lot to this. So let me start, Raphael. Racial inequality and economic inequities are complicated issues. We know to begin solving them, we have to address root causes. You wrote a great essay about this that was published in June. Talk a bit about the root causes as you see them. And how do you think about the Federal Reserve's role in tackling racism?
Well, first of all, good morning, Tom, and good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. And I'm really pleased that we can do this. Always prefer to do these things in person, but given what we've got, we'll kind of go with it. So that's very good. the question of root causes, I think, is a very important one. And, when I think about it, I actually think I feel like I've become a lot more of a historian because it's the history that allows us to understand the things that we need to focus through many, many decades and hundreds of years in this country, a bunch of institutions that were established that really codified inequity. Slavery is obviously one of them, but you think about things like Jim Crow, like requirements for neighborhood segregation, requirements for occupational segregation, and all of those things locked in inequities, and they basically ensured that we were going to have one group of people, African Americans, and in some instances Latinos and even Asians, who were going to be with less, and they were going to struggle. And so at that point, the interesting aspect is once those inequities are locked in, then being race neutral after that will not do anything to reduce the disparities. It actually locks in those disparities and ensures that they will persist for long periods of time. And so if you want to make progress, and how I think about what making progress here is, it is really trying to understand how all those historical decisions that locked in these inequities establish barriers in particular areas, and that we have to understand what those areas are and then attack them specifically. So I think about things like housing and home ownership. I think about things like access to wealth. I think about access to capital, school quality. All of these areas are important barriers that we have to think about. And the Fed is actually starting to engage in all of these areas in ways that are quite important. The other thing I would say before I go into what the Fed can do is I actually do think that we need to be attacking this at a systemic level. So it's not enough to say, oh, that person needs a computer. We need to be thinking, like, why doesn't that happen and emerge at the system level? Why is it that systems are not providing the things that we think everyone needs to succeed? And I think that's a new approach that is being more widely understood and appreciated. And the Fed is, I think, taking a leading role in highlighting a bunch of these things. So what can the Fed do? I actually think about there are 4 areas where the Fed can weigh in. The first is actually to promote things that are working. So both Renee and Tom talked about our community development function and the fact that we go out into communities. We actually see a lot of things that are going on, and there are programs and policies and approaches that actually are starting to move the dial. And because we have a national system of experts and we can reach into communities all over the place, we have an ability to say, look, these are the 6 things that are working in a particular area. You might want to think about that moving forward. A second thing is to do research. And I have a team that's doing a lot of research in this area about what works and what doesn't, or even what the impact of some historical structures has been. One of my research directors in the community development group, Ann Carpenter, just recently published a paper on lease for deeds, where it's actually this crazy, well, I think it's a crazy setup, where the way that the financing for a mortgage happens, you don't actually accrue any equity until the entire mortgage is paid off. And so you could pay for 12 years, and if you are late for one period at that point, you can be thrown out the house and you have nothing left. That is something that was very common in African-American communities. That was a vehicle for home ownership, but it was one that was incredibly tenuous. And you could imagine that there was a lot of capital and wealth that was extracted from African-American communities because of the difficulty of that. No opportunity to cure. So that kind of research can be brought up, and it can allow us to really try to shut down some things that can be abusive and can really harm neighborhoods. A third area is really to advise. And this has become very clear to me during this COVID crisis. We know the crisis has hit minority communities much harder. And I have to say, I've had a ton of state and local officials calling us to ask, if I have small businesses that are struggling, what sorts of things can we do to try to help them and support them? What kind of vehicles and facilities and other programs are available? And so we are engaging with that. And Tom, I know you have the same thing going on in your area. And then the fourth thing I would say is to convene. so much of what's going to be required, we think about racial equity, is to have different kinds of conversations and to put spotlights on things that haven't necessarily had spotlights before. And so, we're convening conferences. We're bringing together people who have sometimes never been in a room together, and ask them to talk about things and on their perspectives, because that's how you're going to find solutions that work for everyone. Tom, you guys are doing the same thing in Richmond. I know, in particularly in the rural space, but just more broadly. And I'm finding them to be incredibly interesting. And I found for us, the reaction has been twofold. One, that they're shocked that we're doing it. And then the second is that they're really grateful. It's made them think about things a little differently. And I think that's an important step if we're going to get to different kind of approaches.
That's great, Raphael. You mentioned so many things: housing, access to wealth, school quality, access to capital. You could put on there early childhood education, entrepreneurship. How do you prioritize those? What's most important? Is there any single one or set of interventions that you think holds the most promise to making a difference?
Well, that's the $10 million question. Let me answer the second question first. I actually don't think that there's one silver bullet. There's one thing that if you can just do that intervention, you've tackled everything. Because the institutions that were set up in the past created inequities in a whole host of dimensions that create a whole host of complicated problems. So the response is going to have to be multi-pronged. When I think about prioritization, I always hesitate to answer that question because it's actually not up to me to decide what's most important for a community or what their most significant barriers are. That's really the job of the community to decide that. And once they decide, then we can connect them up. I can connect them up with a bunch of people who are experts in making progress in that. And so, one of the challenges that I've seen in my district as I've gone around is that communities have not often had the conversation about like what concretely are our problems and which ones do we want to tackle first, which ones do we want to lift up most explicitly. So we go there and we want to say we want to help, but then we don't get clear questions about or clear direction on how we can best use our resources to make progress in communities. So for you guys in Richmond, I would say this is a conversation you have to have and decide whether it's affordable housing, whether it's minority business development and entrepreneurship, whether it's access to capital, or whether it's going to be like a transportation network. All of those could potentially be very important. And one thing I would just add on this is that it is important that this is a regional conversation, that it doesn't break down into jurisdictional boundaries, because economics, markets don't actually understand. They don't actually notice where one city starts and another town ends, or where two counties come together. They look much more broadly at how can I use to produce the goods I need to produce and get them to market, and that's what they're trying to do. And so, if the plan doesn't really include all the parts of the region that can contribute to economic prosperity, then you may miss some things that could otherwise be really, really important to help move things forward.
So, I'll put a stake in the ground. In our community, one of the big issues, I think, is affordable housing. And it's probably you're the best person probably in the world to talk about it. Your research background is all in there. You've served as a senior official at Housing and Urban Development. Talk a bit about affordable housing. How does a community really tackle it? And, is it just about zoning and funding, or is there some secret sauce to really making a difference there?
So I'd say two things on this. It's actually probably going to be more than two, but, two things come to mind initially. First is that to make progress in affordable housing, there needs to be a broad and collective consensus that housing is a problem and that everyone is going to contribute to the solution. One of the most interesting and challenging aspects of housing is that building it is done parcel to parcel, that approval for a project is one project at a time. And so you get the landscape of housing through like thousands of individual decisions about, are we going to let 6 units go here or 14 units go here, or we're going to keep this as open space. And if you're going to have real progress such that housing is available across the region, at multiple price points all over the place. That requires every planning commission in the region, every city council in the region, all the mayors in the region, the business community, and friends and neighbors to all understand that this is important and to agree to take on some of the burden. And so much of what I've seen is cities don't actually understand that if they don't put housing, if they don't agree to have housing communities at lower price points, that imposes burdens and costs on everyone else in the region. You know, one of the reasons why LA has such horrible traffic is that affordable housing is often very far away from where the job centers are, and people still have to get to work, so they're going to drive however far they have to go, and that's going to be through a bunch of communities, and that's going to create congestion and challenge. Until we understand that and everyone's willing to take that on, it becomes a challenge. And so for me, the biggest and most important first thing is everyone has to collectively agree that this is a problem and that they're going to do something about it. Then beyond that, then you get into funding issues, then you get into zoning issues, you get into questions about mixing of uses and how do we collectively create place really that facilitates participation by a number of people with different capabilities and capacities, and that part, that can be the fun part once you get past the view that or the understanding that, you know, this is an everybody problem and it has to be an everybody and every place solution.
I want to talk a bit about experiences on the ground. Your team is on the ground every bit as much as Renee and the rest of ours is. Maybe start with housing, but then I'll broaden it. Atlanta, I used to live there, you know, redid their projects probably 15 years ago. I've heard you say that's a good start, but it's not nearly enough. Talk a bit about the experience on the housing side in Atlanta as you've seen it.
Well, you may know more, at least as much about this as I do, but you know, what I would say is there was a belief in the 60s that the way to build affordable housing was just to build a lot of it in one place. And that turned out to not be really the best approach, particularly the way that the buildings were constructed and how access to spaces inside these large developments was extremely limited. And it allowed for a lot of mayhem and chaos to which then meant you had large tracts of land that were effectively blight. Atlanta I think in the late 70s to early 80s started, maybe actually even later than that, maybe 80s into 90s, started to take those large blighted areas down and reconstruct them and rebuild them in a mixed income, mixed use type of project model. And it really recaptured a lot of land and a lot of space and made possible economic activity and inclusion and just a more continuous fabric of activity. And I think it's been actually quite interesting to see. Now, Atlanta, we have not certainly solved the affordable housing problem. And in fact, the way that our economy has grown is putting a lot of pressure on close-in neighborhoods. And there's a lot of gentrification that is taking place. So we've still got a lot to work on. But one of the things we don't have to work on are really these large blighted areas. And that means that the capital can be deployed much more broadly and much more surgically. And I think that's really been important. A second thing I would say, you know, I understand Richmond has a number of these projects that still prevail, is that they can actually be centers for broad-based and economic vibrancy. I've actually been doing some research on lower income housing tax credit properties in the Chicago region. And one thing that we found is that you build a couple of those and they become anchors for economic development in blighted areas, because they are places where we know capital is being deployed, where we know that there are going to be rules that are put in place to make sure that the streetscapes are nice and are sustainable. You're going to have businesses, you're going to have people who are really aspiring to get better and be better. People want to invest in those places. And so if you can identify a number of those throughout around the city and the region, they can be nodes of investment that can then build upon themselves, and you can start to leverage that investment to get a lot more.
That's great. Talk about some other programs or policies or practices that you or your team have seen, maybe in Atlanta or maybe in other communities across your district?
Well, one of the great things about the job, and Renee mentioned this with you, Tom, I know you're doing the same thing as I am, is you get to go around and you get to see just a ton of communities, meet a lot of people, and just experience sort of what's on the ground. And one thing my team's been really good about doing is making sure I see local things that are interesting, that where you don't really hear about solutions moving forward. I call out a couple that I think are noteworthy. One is around job training and apprenticeship for high school students. There's a company here just south of Atlanta called Southwire, and there's one in Augusta called Textron. Textron's actually very interesting. They make 90% of all golf carts in the world. Augusta National. Tom, you were just there last week, weren't you?
Let's keep talking about inequality, Rafi.
But one of the things that Textron did, which I thought was very interesting, they went to the school district and they said, give me your worst performing students, the students who you think are at risk of dropping out of school. And one thing and they did that and gave them a job and said, we want you to work on the lines producing these golf carts. And at the same time, we're gonna, when you're not on duty or on shift, we're gonna have classrooms right next door. And you're gonna go and you're gonna take your classes and we're gonna get you through high school. And what they found is, first of all, their job was a real job. If they didn't do the stuff on the line, those carts did not get built and the company was gonna go down. And giving them and entrusting them that kind of responsibility, I think at first probably shocked the students, but then it gave them a sense of pride when they started seeing things roll off and they became some of the best workers in the company. And then the second thing that they discovered was that a lot of the students, a number of the students were actually really strong students. They were strong performers, and some became straight A students. And what they learned was that it was creating structure and showing trust and faith in the students that led them to perform. And the circumstances that they grew up in didn't create those opportunities for them. And the students, we actually lost some people, and we've been losing people. There are diamonds in the rough that we can lift up, and I think that's really important. Another one that I talk about that I like is in Alabama, like Heflin, Alabama, and Pell City. There is a program for students, for kids, where it's a daycare center and a school, but it also has attached to it a training program for the parents, right? So you have single parents and others. A lot of the challenges they have to do with what happens with their children when they're working. Well, the way this program was set up, they didn't have to worry about that. They knew where their kids were and they had access to them. And so they could be trained to do things like become pharmacists and to become computer techs, jobs that pay real wages, living wages, that would put them on a different trajectory for sustainability, which I think is incredibly exciting. And then the third one, also in that area, had to do with getting broadband. Well, two parts to this. One was converting old units into senior assisted facilities, which is a huge issue in rural America, which is to redo an old high school. Broadband into the rural community, which was also quite important. And so there's just a lot of stuff going on, and I really enjoy. I would say on this, you notice that these were all about the communities figured out which things were most important, and those were the things that they tried to attack. And again, that gets back to getting yourself and your community self-aware of what's going on, and then making some concrete and specific decisions about how to move forward.
That's great. Chamber RVA has been nice enough to organize this. And so you see a lot of public-private partnerships. You see a lot of business organizations across your district. where do you see those organizations, really making those partnerships work? What do they do that helps make those work?
So, first thing, and I really appreciate that Chamber RVA is actually doing this program. This type of program is one of those essential first steps in creating a broad-based regional and community conversation about who are we, who do we want to be, and how are we going to get there. And that those are three important questions. In terms of examples, many years ago, Salt Lake City did a project called Envision Utah, where and it was actually the whole Wasatch Front from north of the city way down to Provo, where they basically had a community conversation and planning exercise about how do we want this area to grow? What kind of businesses do we want to have? What kind of quality of life do we want our citizens to have? That one is a poster child for success in terms of planning. More close to home, I would just point to Charlotte, North Carolina, which is not far from here, also in Tom's region. Several years ago, the Brookings Institution did an assessment of the 50 largest metro areas in the country and tried to rank them, and they ranked them according to the likelihood that if you were born poor, you could have some kind of economic mobility and move out of poverty. And Charlotte was identified to be 50 out of 50, the very bottom. Atlanta, I think, was 48 at the time, so it's not like I'm throwing stones. We don't have this figured out either. But that shook them, and they collectively came together, business community, the faith community, the nonprofit community, and local government, and said, we got to do something about this. So they developed a plan, and they are executing that plan, and they've moved off of the bottom, and they are continuing to move on this, creating new partnerships and new capabilities that are allowing people to actually move ahead. So I would look to Charlotte as well in this area of economic mobility and resilience and racial equity.
Our branch in Charlotte actually worked with that project quite extensively, and I think Raleigh was 49th as well. And I just say, Atlanta, Raleigh, Charlotte, all incredibly vibrant New South cities. If Richmond had been big enough, it would have been in the mix too. But huge disparities in income, which I think have just survived. So what do you think real change looks like, and how would we know if we're making progress? You and I both look at a lot of data. Are there stats or other indicators you think are particularly useful to measure progress?
So, I think about this at the macro and the micro level. I want to start micro because I do think that there are things that every one of us can do individually that can help make that difference and make that change. One of the things we've been doing at our bank is just looking at our policies and practices, understanding who we are in terms of what we're doing, in terms of promotion and hiring and setting of salaries, just to make sure that we are approaching the world in an equitable way and giving all of our staff members true access to opportunity and ability to thrive and be prosperous. I was on a panel yesterday with Ed Bastian from Delta, and he put out a public statement about the distribution of employees and his staff. And he noted that 23 to 30% of the staff is from minority groups, and only 7% of his senior leadership is. Tracking and understanding those sorts of things can be incredibly important and valuable because it will cause sort of a self-reflection to get a deeper understanding about how that could come to pass, and then allow us to build strategies to move forward. So I think there are lots of things we all can do in our own businesses to make a difference in that regard. And then more broadly, I think that we can start to track participation and inclusion by neighborhood, for example. Where are employees coming from? How is higher education being achieved? What kind of job training is being made available? And who's participating? Because, and you think about Atlanta, just not too far from the bank where we are, there are neighborhoods that have not participated in this vibrant economy for many years. And so they've just not been part of the conversation, and people don't know how to have a conversation with people from those communities. So trying to develop measures that can identify the extent to which we are creating new networks creating new linkages to communities. Like one of the things that we've done, and I'd say our bank will get credit for it, but it was one staff member who said, we're going to adopt a high school and we are going to have an internship program. And we're going to have students come in from a neighborhood that they probably never even seen our building. And we're going to show them what the possible is. And that was just one person basically decided to do it. And it turned out it wasn't that hard to do, and we could move it forward. And that creates new connections. And so if we can get more of those new connections, that can be incredibly powerful. Then there's one last thing I would say on the connections piece, which is I think we all need to examine our own connections. I was on a call in the summertime where a leader, actually with the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, where the Metro Atlanta Chamber, where the leader said, and he basically yelled at everyone and said, how many of you have invited someone to play golf of a different ethnic background? And there was silence because he knew the answer to that question. So those are some of the places where advancement happens, where knowledge gets shared about the things you need to do to be successful in a corporate environment. And so we need to make sure that we're creating the connections such that everybody gets access to those sorts of pieces of information. Now, it's not easy. I'm not here to say that these are easy things. And one of the things we've been exploring in our bank is like, how do you give feedback to people of different backgrounds in ways such that they don't take it as an insult, but rather constructive? That can be challenging, but it's essential. And so we have to try, and we have to make sure that our teams are trained and have the skills to be able to do those things, because that's how you really get to equity from at an organic level.
That's great. Maybe one final question, and then we'll throw it open to questions. So, please put them in if people have them. As we pursue this journey, what pain points should we expect and prepare for? What are going to be the roadblocks that we just ought to know are out there?
Well, I'll just call out two, and there are a lot of them. But one of them is we are going to be uncomfortable continuously, right? The change of this nature is necessarily going to pull us out of our comfort zones and make us sort of grapple and work through things that may not be so straightforward or clean, but are essential. And I've just in the last year or so had a number of conversations with my teams where we've all been uncomfortable, and you can feel it in the room. And there's a tendency for me and for many, like when you get to that level of discomfort, to just shut it down. And we have to fight through that. And I think that's going to be really important. And then a second pain point is going to emerge, because I think there's a perception that if someone else gets something, that I don't get it, that there's a zero-sum aspect to everything. And I actually don't think, well, first of all, I don't think that's true necessarily, but we've got to acknowledge that perception at the outset. For me, I actually think that if we do this well, the pie gets bigger. We get bigger. We get stronger collectively, and there'll be more for everybody. And so we just but that's going to take a journey, and it'll take some time, but we have to remind everyone of that perspective and keep that as the North Star. We are not actually just trying to take the existing and spread it around differently. We're actually trying to create a different existing, which is bigger and broader and more vibrant and more resilient. And ultimately, it'll make us have a much better quality of life.
Awesome. Well, really helpful. Renee, why don't we turn it to you now for questions?
Thank you so much, Presidents Barkan and Bostic. And as a reminder, please enter your questions in the chat. We've got a few good ones already. First, I'm going to take liberty to ask a question of my own, if that's all right. President Bostic, and certainly Tom, if you'd like to weigh in on this, one of the key takeaways I think that you really stated very strongly is that there's a need for a community to come together and assess its individual priorities, right? What are the problems that we face and its specific brand of problems? And in fact, that's something we've heard from prior sessions, which is a really important point. Can you talk about that process of consensus building within a community? What are some elements that make that work? What makes it break down? And is there a specific role for the business community in that conversation?
So the process, well, first of all, I'm going to say, I'm glad this has been a regular topic of this series because it's super important. And I think it's actually essential for developing broad consensus and cohesiveness with all parts of the community. One thing that, Richmond's been on the news a lot in the last, 6 months around its history and its legacies. And there's an unspoken element in a lot of these news stories that many of the voices that are rising up are voices that hadn't been heard before or hadn't been in the earlier conversations. And so we need to make sure that as we develop a process, we go to places that are not our places, our usual places, but go wherever we need to go to hear voices that have a stake in the city and engage in that. And really just open it up and say, look, what do you think our biggest problems are? What things would help your community and the city move forward, and then compile them all. And I would do this sort of in safe spaces for each aspects of the community. And then as a second round, start to bring collections of people together in mixes so that people get to hear other people's aspirations and hopes. And it's not just things that they see on the paper or on the news, but it becomes lived experience, which is so important. In terms of the business community, I think it is incredibly valuable and important that the residents of the city and the region understand that the business community actually shares their values and interests and is willing to be part of the conversation and not necessarily dictate the conversation, and is willing to invest to advance the collective. Like, those are important messages, and I'm not sure that many rank and file citizens actually think about business that way. And it can actually strengthen your social capital and your business prospects, I think, as well. If people feel like you're investing in them, they'll invest in you. And so that's an important message. And I think it can also give cover to hard decisions that leaders need to make. Like if the business community is like, no, we've all had this conversation. We know it's going to be hard. We're going to stand with progress and really support the collective decision making. Those are things that can be very, very, very important.
Thank you for that. And we've got some great questions coming in. Please keep them coming, everybody. One question relates to the third session we had in the series on minority business development. And so the question is, we know that access to capital is a fundamental barrier. What are the best approaches to help solving for that to drive positive change?
Well, this is a very difficult question because of how we do entrepreneurship in this country. So, most small businesses start with family and friends investments. And we know that because of our history, African Americans, families and friends just have less capital. They have less wealth to invest. And so we've got to find ways to counter that. And so for banks, for philanthropy, for businesses who want to have consortia, for investors, thinking differently about what risk looks like and where opportunity might lie, I think is something that we have to seriously invest in. Another thing that we're doing in Atlanta is working with some of the smaller businesses, give them guidance on how things they might do to actually get to larger scale. So we have a consistent and pretty robust engagement in the supplier diversity space here to have conversations about what is it that hire contractors that we demand from contractors. What do you need to show? What kind of experiences are going to be useful moving forward? Then one other thing I would say, which is interesting, and I actually don't have the answer for this. In Atlanta, I think the statistic is something like 95% of all Black-owned businesses have less than 5 or 10 employees, right? So they're incredibly small. And if we're going to have a stronger minority business community, we need to unpack that and understand that. Is it because business leaders don't want to be larger, or is it because they feel constrained? And understanding that, I think, will put us on two different pathways as to what potential nurturing of a minority business community would look like, and give us some guidance as to how we might invest capital to make progress.
To that last point, I'm told that the biggest challenge isn't the first tranche of capital, but is the second tranche of capital, that it's the scaling from, a guy in his garage to a business. And so there may be something that puts that insight together with the capital and says, directing capital toward expansion, not just origination.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And there aren't a lot of institutions that try to fill that space so actively. So that's a conversation we should definitely continue having.
Great, thank you. Any thoughts, speaking back to different threads a community might consider pulling in this space, any thoughts on the importance of transit and mobility as an equity issue?
Well, it's definitely an equity issue. One of the first papers I wrote here with some colleagues was around the mismatch between where people live, where job training programs operate, and where the jobs are. And it turns out they're often in three different places, which puts a tremendous burden on people who may not have either their own form of transportation or have needs in their families such that they can't afford to spend that much time just traveling around. And so thinking about how we develop and structure ourselves spatially so that space doesn't become the barrier, as much of a barrier, is important. So that could be through transit. It could be through siting of childcare, for example, and thinking about those sorts of things. So you, instead of needing to do 2 trips, you can do 1. All of those sorts of things are going to be quite important moving forward. I actually think that I'm coming from Los Angeles, where transit is a huge problem, and compared to there, I'm probably a little jaded. And I think the nice types of communities and regions is that the types of investments may need to be, well, there are 2 aspects. There's one, it could be more targeted. So there may be a smaller set of job centers that you have to get people to, but there may be other options. So I think in transit, the express bus, bus rapid transit is something that is not often talked about, but I think in many regards can be a useful solution for getting people places very quickly. And they're even doing that in LA, which is very difficult given how much development there is. But I think there are real possibilities across the country for that.
Great. And President Bostic, your team has done a lot of work to understand levers we might pull to increase inclusion, things like the benefits cliff, something the Richmond Fed has worked with you all on, and reframing how we think about financial inclusion. So how can communities put those findings into practice?
So, the benefits cliff idea is around the idea that many of our benefits programs, so you think about housing vouchers or other things, for every dollar you earn, you lose $1 of that benefit. Now, it turns out that many people are getting support, have food stamps plus housing vouchers plus other types of support. It may be that when you earn that extra dollar, you're actually losing $3 of benefit. So you're technically worse off for trying to make yourself better. And so that's not a problem with the person who is getting the receipts. That's a problem with the incentives that we have set up. And people are responding to those incentives in actually rational ways. If they're going to be worse off, and some of our statistics our analysis have suggested that it can take 10 or 15 years for that person to break even again after those losses, given sort of the time it takes to get training and how income increases as you get further along in your career. So if you're looking at a 15-year break-even point and you have 2 children, or you have an elderly parent who needs support, or whatever it is, right, the answer may be you're better off just staying where you are. but that means that we've now locked them and their family into a dependency. So we are working with local governments all over the country to try to restructure how they set up the incentives around this. And the reason why this is particularly challenging is that many of the support programs, the details vary by county or by town or by state. So you actually have to go county to county. This is like door to door type, door by door type of combat to try to get to a more coherent and accessible program of incentives. So we have memorandum of understanding with I think 6 or 7 states now. We're working with a number of cities to try to get them all to change how they approach the idea about benefits. I think that's really important. Another thing I'm working on, you mentioned financial inclusion. In Atlanta, we have a lot of businesses that touch the payment space and a lot of fintech companies that are bringing technology into the area. And one thing I've tried to raise is that sometimes innovation definitely broadens access, but sometimes it constrains it as well. And I think in particular about the communities that are primarily cash-based. Many of these apps and many of this technology doesn't really facilitate that. I'm personally scarred by this. I'm just going to say that I was driving somewhere in LA and I got on one of the toll roads, and then I realized that they had taken out all the toll booths, and so either you had a transponder or you couldn't pay. And so I'm not going to tell you how I got out of that, but I didn't get a ticket on that. But it made me think, what happens to all these people who may not have access to that kind of stuff? And what kind of things do they need to do? What kind of gymnastics do they need to go through to just do basic things? And so I'm trying to make sure that as we continue to innovate and build technology into our systems, we do so in a way that is maximally inclusive and appreciates and understands all the different types of ways that people live, and tries to incorporate that into that innovation so we can move forward.
They probably just sent you a ticket, Raphael.
No comment.
All right, thank you so much. I think it's time for us to wrap up and move on. And we've got a Mentimeter question, I believe, to pose to everybody. At this point, I want to thank Tom and Raphael so much for being here and the many concrete insights you shared today. I'm personally grateful to you both for being here. And thank you so much for helping us move this important conversation along. And with that, I think we're going to move to the Mentimeter question, and then I'm going to toss it to Ken Johnson. Thank you so much.
Good morning. I am Ken Johnson, and thank you, Tom and Raphael. You guys were spot on with a lot of our values and how we think about many of the topics you discussed this morning. We want to thank Brian and Kelly and the entire team for putting the summit on. This has been fantastic. I am pleased, our organization is pleased to be a partner with the Chamber with this summit, and because it really aligns with our core values and who we are as a company at JMI. I am not going to spend a lot of time talking about who we are and what we do as a company and just simply say we believe in connecting brands, cultures, and communities. What I have done is put together a video that reflects much of what we think Richmond can be and who we should be as a community when we look to tomorrow. And we want to look into the future in the right way. We want to look at an integrated community. We want to make sure that folks have proper mobility and many of the things that Raphael discussed this morning. So with no further ado, I want to introduce a video to you. It's called RVA Tomorrow. And following the video, you will hear from my friend, Ms. Greta Harris. She's the president and CEO of Better Housing Coalition.
Last night, people protesting it escalated as demonstrators were lashed by tear gas and rubber bullets.
Speaking in black and white. Speaking in black and white. Can't change overnight. Speaking in black and white. Speaking in black and white. Can't change overnight. Can't change overnight. Speaking in black and white. Speaking in black and white. Can't change overnight. Speaking in black and white. Speaking in black and white. Can't change overnight. Can't change overnight.
Ms. Greta?
Thank you, Ken, for that kind introduction and that thought-provoking video. My name is Greta Harris, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Better Housing Coalition that develops quality, service-enriched affordable housing in the RVA region. I also have the great honor of being a board member at Chamber RVA and serving as a member of the Chamber's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force that is working on closing race-based opportunity gaps here in the Richmond region and help to shape the Shared Value Summit. Pre-COVID-19, the RVA region was really excelling. New and expanding businesses, a growing food, arts, and culture scene, and people were moving here in droves. And we maintained a 25% poverty rate in the city and saw growing poverty rates in the surrounding counties, mostly reflecting communities of color. We're now in the midst of a global pandemic, an economic recession, and an overdue reckoning about race in our country. And we maintained a 25% poverty rate in the city and growing poverty in the surrounding counties, mostly reflecting communities of color. I wanted to share this blended image of American protest, one from 1963 with the March on Washington, and one showcasing the protest of 2020. Nearly 60 years have passed, and we're asking for the same thing, a just society where everyone can live in a good community, where everyone can have a quality education, where everyone can have a job that offers dignity and pays a living wage, where everyone can be valued. Is this the moment to be bold and take calculated risks to have a different community outcome, to have a just RVA? I'm so happy to spend a few minutes with my friends Reggie Gordon, Richmond's Deputy Chief Administrative Officer for Human Services, a soulful, caring, gentle man, and Melanie Barnes, Director of the Democracy Initiative at UVA, a global thinker who really cares. Their extensive bios are on the Chamber website for your review. Melanie is a native Richmonder, and Reggie and I are newcomers that have only lived in Richmond for a few decades. Melanie and Reggie, thank you so much for being here and welcome to this conversation. I moved to Richmond in 1992 and have never experienced anything like the protests that happened here in this summer. It certainly evoked a wide range of emotions, and it's just been pretty unbelievable. Melanie, what do you think it would take for this to be in Richmond to take bold moves to unleash the full economic potential of all of our people?
Well, first of all, Greta, it is such a pleasure to be here with you and with Reggie. Your leadership has and is transforming Richmond, and you are such an incredible incredible leader in our community. And I also want to thank the Chamber for inviting me to participate in this conversation. You know, the question you ask is one that I've thought about over the years, and in my career, both working in the Congress as well as working in the White House, and thinking about why some communities that have tackled complex, hairy, challenging social issues have been successful at addressing them. What is it that they've done right, and what would Richmond have to do? And there are about 5 things that I think about, and all of this is complex and challenging. The first one is something that Raphael actually alluded to or spoke to a bit in his comments, which was that collectively we have to, as a community, identify our agenda and our goals. And there are times, and you and I have had this conversation before, there are times when it feels like there are so many issues and they are all so pressing that our instincts are to boil the ocean, to try and take it all on at the same time, because they're also interconnected. But I think as we identify those issues, we also have to start to prioritize those issues, and to build muscle memory around the way that we start to address them. I also believe very, very strongly, and I've seen this in other communities, that we have to align across sectors. Because of the complexity of these issues, it's rare that one sector is going to be able to find a solution on its own. So the private sector, the nonprofit sector, grassroots, philanthropy, all of the nonprofit sectors, all will have to come together and align and work and through mutually reinforcing activities to deal with these issues. I also think, and this is the point where people often glaze over, that we've got to evaluate and measure our progress. And then we have to learn from what we're doing so that we can put that information back into the process and to continue to refine our steps moving forward. The other thing, the last 2 things, one, I know that we have to think about ways to attract more resources and new capital into Richmond. This isn't something that Richmond is going to just be able to solve on its own. The size of our problem, and you know housing better than anyone, the size of our housing problem alone is well into the billions of dollars. So we've got to think about how we raise and leverage more resources. And then finally, the piece that I think often seems most ephemeral to people, that people often discount, but is very important, I think it'll come up further in our conversation, is that we have to build trust in our community. It is something that is sorely lacking, and it is also the glue that prevents us from aligning across sectors in the way that I just mentioned.
Absolutely. Trust is so fundamental. Reggie, do you have other ideas on what would make this the moment for us to make unbelievable change here in the Richmond region?
Thanks, Greta. And I too want to thank the members of the Chamber and the Chamber for this experience. And I'm always grateful to be in the company, even if it's virtual, with you and Melody. And you are true thought leaders and transformative people in our community. So I actually did grow up in Richmond. I moved here with my family moved here in 1967 from Blackstone, Virginia to the big city of Richmond, 1967. So, and having studied this community, I had a wonderful childhood in Richmond, grew up in the same neighborhood with Melody. It's time for Richmond to have a psychological reboot. I think what has gone wrong, what I know has gone wrong, is we are sort of trapped in the belief that we underachieve or we have failures that seem insurmountable. And I think in order for us to have a shared value, we need to celebrate and acknowledge our assets, things that have gone well, whether that's the natural assets of our community, the people that we need to celebrate, businesses, culture. And I do have an idea. Imagine if we could get 100 people that represent the mosaic of Richmond. I mean, literally match the demographics of our community and ask them from their unique perspective to articulate what they find interesting or intriguing or amazing about Richmond. And we collect that together as almost like a booklet that we all get to share. Because right now, we can rattle off everything that's wrong with Richmond, but there are so many things that are strong and positive, but we don't have a way to compare and contrast what our neighbors on the other side of town feel is a beautiful aspect of Richmond compared to people in our neighborhoods. And I think that's how we build this connectivity that might help us to move forward from an asset-based perspective as opposed from a deficit-based perspective.
I think that's so important to be able to look, change your viewpoint on what's going on here and the possibilities of what we can achieve together. You know, in 2004, there was this book that was published called What's the Matter with Kansas? And it chronicled the rise of anti-elitist conservatism, where the masses supported a political movement that voted against their own self-interest. It's opposite to what you just said, Reggie, but you know, what's the matter with Richmond? And why are we so steeped in an incomplete history that doesn't really embrace equitable change? And there perpetuates this need for us to take baby steps rather than taking these big, gigantic leaps that would make a really tangible difference to so many of our neighbors. Reggie.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, you know, that's such a great question. Although I do love this community, there is something weird about how we have this veneer of civility that I think has limited our ability to be bold. I mean, we don't even blow our car horns here in Richmond. so what just happened over these past few months, I think, is a jolt to our psyche. And so what do we learn from that? And I was uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable with the images of people protesting and yelling. But maybe it's time for us to recognize that's how change occurs. And so because imagine when we have bold leadership or ideas in Richmond, our tendency is to sort of take pot shots at it in order to reduce it down to something that we feel is manageable, back to reminiscing about how it will fail because we always fail, rather than celebrating bold leaders and lining up behind them. We're not good at following bold leaders. I don't know what that's about, but it seems to be a problem. We need to get past that.
And we had some in 2020, had some bold moves that started, and we had a lot of people that came after the idea that we could do something so big like the Navy Hill development, and it just it was so disappointing on so many different levels for what it could have brought to the city. So Melanie, you've been here for quite some time, you know, baby steps versus big jumps. Why is that going on in our community?
Sure. Well, a couple of things. One, I do want to push back on the idea that we won't follow bold leaders. John Mitchell was a bold leader. Maggie Walker was a bold leader. Bold leaders often, though, get marginalized and ostracized. And we have to think about what bold leadership means for our time as well, and to also be comfortable with it, but also to sit with the discomfort that comes with that. Because bold leadership also challenges us to think differently. It challenges us to think about what our posture is in this moment of change, and why, as a city, we seem to be satisfied with the status quo. You know, Greta, going to the question as you framed it, and this, I remember the book, What's the Matter with Kansas, and these conversations about people acting against self-interest. And what I believe is that people are not necessarily acting against self-interest. They are acting in furtherance of an interest that we may not always see or we may not always understand. That they're acting in furtherance of something sometimes that is existential to them, whether it is their own view of themselves in the world, whether it is a hierarchy that they're comfortable with or the status quo. And I think in a city as old as Richmond, and in a place that embodies I think, the best and the worst of our democracy, that our history has often, with good reason, bred the distrust that I see here. I mean, I grew up here. I was here until I left for college. I was gone for many years. And my husband and I chose to come here. I mean, there are a lot of places. We could have stayed in Washington. We could have gone to a lot of places, but we were excited to come here. And it is evident to me as adult Melody living here just how far the distrust goes. And I think the history feeds that with good reason, that for a long time, a small group of people controlled the city. They controlled the politics. They controlled the business community. And that when historically people realized that power was slipping away, that they started to divest the city of its resources because they were no longer going to be in control of that. I think we have to be honest about what our history is. And that's part of the discomfort that I mentioned that we have to sit with, that people were willing to let the city wither if they could no longer control it. And that history and that legacy and that cultural memory that's attached to that created today's Richmond. It's a place where the status quo works really well for some people. It is a place, as I said, where distrust is palpable. For some, progress seems unimaginable. That cannot be for me. We can't not move forward. That is also a piece of the culture. It's culture. I won't say it's the DNA because I think it is reversible, but it sits there and it has made incrementalism an art form here. I think that new muscles are going to have to be built, and that will take time. That will take honesty. That will take sitting with some discomfort. It will take data and facts and storytelling, and people listening to those stories. It will take working together as well as some faith. But I think that the catalyst for doing all of that will have to be, I hope it will be, the fact that Richmond as it is right now is unsustainable for too many people, and therefore it should be unsustainable for all of us. I'll close by saying, I remember during the 2008 campaign, I spent a weekend in Missouri campaigning with Ashley Judd, driving around in a van. I mean, it's one of those surreal kind of things. And I remember at various campaign stops, she used to say, if you keep doing what you've done, you're going to get what you got. And if we keep on in this way, if we let ourselves be managed by that distrust and by that history and by that cultural memory without finding new ways to work out of it, we're going to keep on getting what we've got.
I want to talk about the bold leaders again, because, when I moved here in the early 90s, there were a handful of people. If you could get your foot in that circle and make it, then you were in like Flynn and you could accomplish anything because it was so few people making decisions. Reggie, you and I have had conversations where, and I don't want to harp on Navy Hill. That's just fresh in my mind right now. But there were people. We worked so hard to try to get to be inclusive with that development. And Reggie, you and I spoke about some people who we were working so hard to make sure they were going to have benefit, didn't think the development and the investment was for them. So how do we recognize that we have maybe our traditional leadership base, which is in Richmond has been driven a lot by the business community, but then we have other grassroots leaders whose voices and perspectives are just as important as others that have been more established here in the community?
Yeah, we could talk for hours about post-mortem on Navy Hill, and
it's its own panel.
I know. It's just there are a few people who probably felt they were not at the right table at the right time, and they had the ability to sort of contort the narrative. Let's put it that way. Meanwhile, as you and I know, and Melanie too, we did talk to community members, and they said things like, from an office community wealth building perspective, if we only had more jobs downtown, we could thrive. And so when Navy Hill came about, I was like, oh my gosh, the planets are lining up. The people have said, we want to be able to have living wage opportunities that we can walk to in proximity to downtown Richmond. And I think this is our inflection point. Listen to the people. We're all saying it. You know, the ideas about economic mobility and how we can move forward have to probably start with the people that are the experts. And those are the people who live this life of struggle day in, day out, where they may not be in our respective networks. So how do we then expand our networks and expand our tables to include them as we dissect ideas, explore initiatives, and then get their blessing to move forward? And we heard it earlier with the Fed execs, and then infuse money to support ideas that have been generated from the community. I think that's the important shift. And I've seen it in my work with the city, empowering individuals who have felony backgrounds that weren't able to get jobs, giving them the ability to get training to become a CDL driver. And I have a story that's front of mind that once that guy got that training, he saved money, purchased his own tractor trailer truck, started his own company, built a home, now starting another business. So it's just taking that belief that he always had that in him, but that moniker of returning citizen was closing doors. So we need to open up these economic opportunities for people who may have been marginalized.
Mm-hmm. You know, I saw President Obama interview last night, and he was talking about one of the catalytic moments in his life was that he had people around him that believed in him when he didn't necessarily even believe in himself.
Exactly.
And we all need that in order to not only survive, but to thrive and be our best selves.
Yeah.
You know, so back in 2000, oh my goodness, that's 20 years ago, I had the opportunity to go to China, and it was just a fascinating experience for me. And that was about the time that cell phones were really getting traction here in the US, but in China, man, they were far superior to us. And as a country, and China's mostly rural in the western part of the country, they leapfrogged their traditional telephone infrastructure of the poles and the lines because it was going to take way too long and cost way too much in order to try to bring that type of infrastructure to the rural parts of the country. And they embraced new technology and new thinking by using cell towers and by just jumping over the traditional way of doing things. They were able to connect millions of their citizens to economic opportunities that previously weren't available. So Melody, how can the RVA region really flip our thinking to unleash the talents that we know are in impoverished communities and help promote economic productivity to a quarter of our citizens in the city who've been systemically rooted in poverty?
Yeah, I am. You were talking about China. It made me smile and think back. You were talking about China, and before that about President Obama. I remember there were times when we were in the White House and, you know, the president had gone on some foreign trip and he'd come back and he would jokingly say, and he was joking, you know, those command and control systems, you can get a lot done in those kinds of systems, which is true, but it's not democracy. And I think to your point, China's ability to set a path and to organize the resources, their resources, and a workforce of literally billions of people in furtherance of that goal is not to be underestimated. And we are watching them do that with energy. We're watching them do that with technology. It's fascinating. It will have a significant impact on our economy, on the global economy, but that's also another panel. We won't be able to do that. But we can organize ourselves for success. One of the things that I think is challenging for Richmond is that even among American cities, that Richmond's governance structure and our relationship to the state government puts us at a disadvantage. You know, it's always good in your household if you quote your husband. So you all know Marlon. And I will say, and something that he wrote recently, he mentioned the fact that our city council and our mayor have to regularly reinforce with our community the fact that our structure in and of itself is really constrained. City government is quite constrained, and we have to understand that so that we can also intelligently focus on the hard choices that we have to make. So you think about Dillon's rule, for example, and all that means for our community and our ability to control our budgets and taxes and that kind of thing. Those are significant issues. All of that said, when it comes to unleashing the talents of our people, I also think about the work that Reggie has done in the Office of Community Wealth Building, and with his predecessor, Thad Williamson, and Corey Walker. We just recently co-edited a book talking about community wealth building. And one, bringing this asset-based approach that Reggie also mentioned earlier, that people who are low income are not liabilities. They're just people that have fewer resources. And as a result, bringing everyone to the table, including, in that means crisscrossing our entire community. So we get back to what I said at the top. We are identifying and articulating our shared goals and our shared agenda. And collectively, we are setting bold equity goals for our city, and that we are thinking about wealth building, not just income, but we're thinking about wealth building and thinking about wealth in all of its forms. So the obvious form in terms of economic and income growth, but also social capital, that we're thinking about shared and community resources that are part of our asset base, again, across our community. And that we're also thinking about a variety of economic tools that we can use to create wealth. So everything from business ownership, and I know there's often a strong desire for business ownership, but we're also unlocking community assets, that we are developing new assets, that we are also attracting new private capital, which I've mentioned before. And just to go back to our session, our group session on Navy Hill, that was also a way to bring a significant amount of new capital into our city. And to do that using a set of economic tools that address some of the things that Richmonders said they're most fearful of in terms of being left on the hook for things that don't work. But at the same time, we weren't willing to engage in a fully factual debate and conversation about that, nor were people willing to look completely at all of the other examples and come to the table and have a robust and vigorous fact-based debate about how those kinds of economic tools could be used to build something here, to bring jobs here, as Reggie was just talking about, to bring more affordable housing here. So I think that community wealth building approach can be an important lens for us to do what you were talking about.
Yeah. You know, I want to share just one example with our state structure, and it is challenging with the Dillon rule in that, you know, we know that we need affordable housing across the board. There's a deficit not only here in our region, but across the nation. And this was before the global pandemic. And one solution that has been very effective in other communities around the country is inclusionary zoning. So President Bostic talked about, you know, everybody problems and everybody solutions. And so it would facilitate scalable, affordable housing, not only in impoverished areas, but in communities of opportunity. And our mayor is interested in doing inclusionary zoning, but we have to go to the General Assembly to get permission in order to do that. So that's just some of the push and pull that we have to contend with here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We also talked about just shared goals, and my career here in Richmond has just been fascinating. And some mornings, you know, the business community likes to get up really early, and I could have C-suite meetings at 7:30 in the morning, and then that same day at 7:30 in the evening, I could be in a public housing community meeting. And it was quite an honor to be with leaders from such different socioeconomic, political, and cultural perspectives. What was always amazing to me, if I would just stop for a moment and really just translate what people were saying, is that both groups were saying the same thing in many ways, maybe using different words, but their hope for our future community was almost the same. And what do you guys think? And I'll go to Reggie first, and then we'll end with Melanie. What's the best opportunity for our region to be more inclusive for economic growth? And share just one idea that RVA chamber members and others can take as an actionable item to advance this idea. Reggie?
Yeah, I'll share one idea. As a preface, I want to say that we have to get in closer proximity to each other in order to lay the groundwork for change, because, you know, whether it's befriending people, we actually have a website or a movement here about befriending, so that we can become advocates when issues come up like affordable housing in your community. It's no longer some stranger across town that might be scary to me. It's, oh, that friend of mine who happens to live across town but needs better affordable housing options, having her live near me is not a scary thing. So it's just humanizing all of these issues. So the big idea, or an idea, is something that we have toyed with here and we haven't gotten much traction on it, but is child savings accounts. And I'll explain what that is. Other communities have done this. It's a way to invest. We're investing in all children, let's say in Richmond Public Schools. We set, whether it's every child in kindergarten, every child in third grade, or every child, period. We decide to set up accounts that have resources in them that can grow over time. And the research and Melody probably knows this, across the country has indicated that if there is this goal at the end of your senior year of high school, that when you graduate, there is some money that's available either for trade, school, or going to college that sort of propels a family and a child forward. It feels reparative in a way. You know, it's equity. It's just a way to symbolize from the business community and others that we want to sow into and invest in the children in our community. And I think if we had a SWAT team of folks who are ready to jump on that, it would be tremendous.
Thank you, Reggie. Great idea. Melanie, take us out with what's our best opportunity to make sure that we have inclusive growth here, and just one actionable step that folks could take.
Sure. A couple of things. Yeah, Reggie was talking about baby bonds, or at least in some contexts, they're referred to as baby bonds. I know my former deputy is working with JP Morgan Chase, and they are working on such an initiative in various communities. I wanted to hit on one other thing that Reggie mentioned before I jump in. I have no dog in this fight, except this was brought to me and I intend to participate. StoryCorps has started here, One Small Step. This idea, we're a pilot city, the people who are different from one another, who are strangers to one another, engaging in a conversation. They will be housed ultimately in the Library of Congress. But it is one small step to us starting to see the humanity in one another, and people who are different from one another. A couple of things. I started out talking about these communities that were doing difficult things and doing them successfully, starting to see change. When you look at those communities, and I am speaking to the part of your question, Greta, about what can members of Chamber RVA do, in those communities, 81% of those communities, the business community is significantly involved in those efforts. And of those communities, 78% of them have C-suite or executive level involvement. So we're talking about very senior involvement and in the business community. And 71% of those, someone from the chamber or the leader of the chamber is also involved. The business community has such an important role to play in this cross-sector work. So doing what? offering vision and strategy support. I look at the work, for example, in Nashville, Tennessee right now. The business community was the one that really kicked off what they have done to address their high school dropout problem. And by sponsoring and leading the way with a survey that set the frame for the work that the mayor was then able to put in place. You think about the management expertise and business skills that sit in the business community. The Strive Network, which is one of the most successful, started in Ohio and Kentucky, now is being scaled across the country, cradle to career education. GE devoted the training and the process around their Six Sigma work to Strive, and now that shapes the way the Strive workshops and smaller working groups work. You think about the work with government leaders, obviously there's the fundraising aspect to this, and also the data gathering that I mentioned before. So I'm not mentioning a particular thing like baby bonds, for example, but there are multiple ways that the business community can be involved as when the city says, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we want to move forward collectively.
Great. Well, there's all sorts of possibilities on things that we can do together. And Melanie and Reggie, thank you guys so much for being here and for sharing your thoughts. And the next time we'll have adult beverages and we'll sit down while social distancing and continue the conversation, because it's worth the effort of trying to figure out solutions. So thank you guys very much for participating today. I think at this point we have a Minty question where we're putting up, let's see, I believe it's sharing with us key takeaways you heard from today's discussion, I believe. And so you can put in that code. And also we would encourage people to go to the chat if they have some key takeaways here. You know, I'm getting close to 30 years here in Richmond, and I love this community. This is home for me. And while some of the challenges that remain before us seem daunting, and maybe they really are daunting, we have the solutions. We have all of the puzzle pieces that we need to be better together. But the puzzle pieces aren't quite fitting the way they should be to completely maximize and leverage the collective talents and passion that we have for our community. But I think we can do it. And I think, as Melanie and Reggie were talking about, it takes trust. It takes an ability to find the humanity in each of us, even though people may look different, they may think differently. All of us are valuable because we are the same. And I would just encourage people to think about breaking bread with someone who is totally different from you. It's amazing. I love cooking, and I invite people over, or I used to invite people over before the pandemic, to just break bread and have conversations. And it's an amazing jump start to building relationships. And that's the way business gets done. That's the way change management happens, by building trusting relationships. And so we thank you for all of the great ideas that are popping up here around cross-sector partnerships between the nonprofit, private, government, and business sectors coming together, building trust, trying to have an asset perspective, building on the strengths of the community. Okay, I'm trying to read. Obviously, my bifocals aren't working so well. Again, I'm seeing a lot of cross-sector partnerships. So no one sector, no one leader will be able to solve these issues. It's only when we come together, it sounds like, that we're going to be able to be stronger. We all do better when we all do better. Just such a simple concept, but tough to implement sometimes. I'm excited to hear that StoryCorps is going to be coming to Richmond. I love that program, to be able to just find all the different ways that we have connected tissue among us as human beings. I think our time is just about wrapped up. We want to thank you all for participating, and especially Melanie and Reggie for sharing that conversation with me. Before Brian and Sherry Armstrong from the Community Foundation come back and sort of wrap up our program, and this whole series has just been fantastic. We want to invite Mandy from Dominion Energy to come in and as a key sponsor for this event, and just thank them for their leadership and support in being able to facilitate this amazing series of conversations. Mandy?
Well, thank you very much, Greta. I appreciate it. It's an honor to be with you here today for this discussion about regional leadership on economic mobility and inclusive growth. The past few months of the pandemic, when stocks have risen as employment struggled, have given us a sobering reminder that those issues don't just resolve themselves. They need intentional effort by all of us. Dominion Energy has thought long and hard about these topics. As you know, we have a vision of building a clean and sustainable energy future, and we are leading a national transition toward cleaner, more renewable energy. By 2050, we will achieve net zero carbon and methane emissions across all our electric and natural gas operations in all states where we do business. In 7 years, we have gone from 0 megawatts of solar power to the third largest solar portfolio of any investor-owned utility in the United States. Off the coast of Virginia Beach, we are building the biggest wind farm this side of the Atlantic. We have the largest renewable gas partnership in the country, and we are investing heavily in energy storage through battery pilot projects, electric school buses that can back up renewables, and continued exploration of another pumped hydro storage station like the one we have in Bath, which is the world's biggest. Now, this transition offers great opportunity. For instance, last month, the Richmond consulting firm Mangum Economics released a study showing that the offshore wind industry alone could support more than 5,000 jobs in Hampton Roads and generate $740 million in revenue for each gigawatt of installed capacity. Our wind farm, incidentally, will be 2.6 gigawatts. So the upside is huge, but we should not pretend that the transition to a clean energy economy will come without costs. It will have some, especially for those who earn their living from carbon-intensive occupations. That is why Dominion Energy is committed to ensuring a just transition of its energy business. We feel strongly that the costs of transition should not be borne disproportionately by any one group, least of all the most vulnerable. We also want the opportunities of the clean energy economy to be distributed fairly. Everyone should have the opportunity, means, and training to obtain decent employment. Dominion Energy remains committed to developing initiatives to retrain existing employees as it maps a balanced, reliable, and cost-effective approach to a clean energy future. The company is evaluating existing skill sets, identifying new skill sets needed to support its clean energy investments, and determining if any training and development opportunities are needed for employees to be prepared for the jobs of the future. That is why we support a variety of organizations and efforts focused on developing the energy workforce, including our partnership with Tidewater Community College, which created one of the first career study certificates in renewable energy technologies and will train many of the region's offshore wind technicians. As we advance toward our goal of net zero emissions by 2050, we are going to be intentional about listening to all perspectives and considering the interests of all our stakeholders. When we talk about a clean and sustainable energy future, we mean sustainable for everyone, because sustainable, but only for some, is an oxymoron. Our goal is to ensure that all people and communities can continue to flourish, and no one gets left behind as we walk together into the future. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak today.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Mandy. My name is Sherry Armstrong. I am the president and CEO of the Community Foundation and am with Brian today to help wrap up our session. But first, I want to thank you, Mandy and Dominion, for your incredible support of this program and the work you are doing inside and outside your business to promote equity and inclusion. I also want to thank the Chamber and the staff, particularly at the Chamber, for putting these events on. They have been incredible and offer tremendous opportunity, of which I'm going to speak to in a minute. And I also just want to give a shout out to Greta, Reggie, and Melody. We are so fortunate to have the tremendous leadership we have here in Richmond and in the region. And so I'm just really thrilled for them being willing to participate and especially appreciate their honesty, passion, and their candor through this conversation. From the Community Foundation, it's been really important for us to be a part of this effort. And I just want to offer a couple of reflections that I know Brian's going to do the same. But, you know, first and foremost, I think these discussions are helping us to align around two really important viewpoints across the region. First of all, we all seem to crave a more equitable community and one that builds on the strengths and assets of all its members. And an important step towards making that vision a reality is to address systemic racism and other root causes that are holding back too many people in our region from achieving their true potential. And what's been so wonderful about this series is, I think, from the trust perspective that others talked about on the panel, you know, the ability for us to build that trust is to have the hard conversations and really to identify what have been our challenges and to be honest about that and be willing to move forward. And I think this theory has represented that. You know, in philanthropy, a lot of times the emphasis is placed on money, but what I feel is more important is how and where we spend our time so we can make the best possible decisions. And we have been committed at the Community Foundation to listening, learning, and connecting with people and partners so that we can understand the landscape of the need more and opportunity in our region, and specifically as it relates to equity and inclusion and as we move forward. And that's what the summit has been about and why the foundation has been so proud to be a part of it. You know, I think my last takeaway is, and some of you on this call have heard me say this, is that the opportunity is now for our city and region. We have a moment in time that if we don't collectively come together and reimagine our region in a way that's better for everyone going forward, we will have missed that opportunity. And we will be a city and a region that won't grow and won't evolve. And 10 years from now, we can't sit here and say we're in the same place. So shame on us if we don't seize this moment. And individually, we are doing great things in our community, giving our time, giving our money. And institutionally, all of us are doing things independently. But really the message for me and what this summit has really represented is it's a collective effort, cross-sector collaboration. We have to be more intentional and get focused and decide on how we're going to do this together. So Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you to give your reflections, but thanks again for allowing us to be a partner and be part of this. And thanks again for the Chamber's leadership in really getting this dialogue and conversation and hopefully incredible action to come from all of this. So thanks. Brian?
Sherry, thank you not only for being a part of today's session, but really your thoughts, process, and your vision, really your heart for this region that you and your team share for us and lead with us in doing so many wonderful things. And so just your partnership throughout this series has been just wonderful, and we could not thank you enough and your team for helping make this possible. So we appreciate you more than you know. The Shared Value Summit, has given us a chance to all come together, across this region, across business sectors, philanthropic sectors, community sectors, ministerial and faith sectors. We've tried to make sure we were listening to all. We wanted to listen, observe, and discuss what really matters to us as a community, and then create that shared context for our future. All 4 sessions of the summit presented local and national leaders who shared ideas that hopefully inspired you and your company to take action in a different way and looking at the world through a different lens. I think today is no different. We heard from really phenomenal two Federal Reserve presidents. I don't know that happens very often in this kind of context, but for have them set up not only what they're doing across their footprint, but also in their individual headquarters cities, and to be able to help us realize what's possible when we compare ourselves and contrast ourselves to other places, we can truly move forward. But also those local leaders, like we heard from today, Melody and Reggie and Greta, just phenomenal. Sherry, you're right. These people are just, every day going out there and trying to make a difference for themselves in the sense of, using their talents appropriately, but also looking out for their neighbor and trying to make this a better place to live, work, and thrive. I think if I take one thing, or really a couple things, the first one is we all know that we will not reach the vision and the promise we want for this region unless we truly weave or sow, or whatever term you're happy with, equity into everything we do. We have not had that history, whether it be both in the Richmond region, but also across this country. And so when we first become intentional that equity will be our North Star, equity will be what we wake up every day to make sure that we all can achieve all that we want to do, then we will have the promise for what I think our country is supposed to be about. I also think the true potential of our region's economic opportunity cannot be realized until we adopt that posture of true inclusion and participation. That regardless of what we're talking about, that is the hallmark, is that we will be inclusive and strive for equity. And then also, just on the selfish note, in the sense that I do work with the business community, I'm very proud of that. Love Melody's comment that if you go just look at the data, everywhere that change is happening, everywhere that we're making a difference, the business community has stepped up, and it's going to require that again. We're going to have to use our talents, our influence, our know-how, and our connectivity, but also our humility, if we, the business community, are going to be a true faith partner in moving this region forward in these conversations. So, Sherry, it's been hard to take such 4 powerful sessions and narrow them down to a couple takeaways, but that's sort of my thoughts at this moment.
Yeah, and Brian, I would say, I think all of us, especially in the philanthropic and nonprofit sector, I know I can speak for many of us, we're willing to really be at the table with the business community to think about this kind of change and what we can do together. We've done some great things in the region too. We have some good examples, the spirit of collaboration. I think we just have to Melody's point, build that muscle memory more and get more intentional. But I think there is this sense of we're all in it together. As we wrap the series, we do want to take a moment and celebrate, to Brian's point, how many people have been part of the programs. Been broad and diverse group of nearly 300 cross-sector leaders have participated, which kudos to the Chamber again. And this really is a true testament to the great partnerships we've formed to bring this content to our community. So thanks to the partners and the sponsors and the 20 local and national experts we've heard from in the last 4 weeks. It has been an incredible series. So thanks to everyone who made that happen.
I can't agree anymore with that. Those comments here. I mean, I think if you look at all that we've done, we just had remarkable agreement from so many to be a part of this, and that's just not always that doesn't always happen either. So again, I thank all that have participated. Let me also just again on a personal note, because of our team, thank Kelly McCall. Kelly headed the leadership team to put this entire summit together, to create this opportunity for conversation, and to make sure that we were doing what we should do at this moment in time. It's been a long summer for all types of reasons. From the pandemic, we're all still struggling with that. The economic strife that's come from having the pandemic be a part of the economy, but also what we've gone through since George Floyd's tragic murder. And so the point is, how do we go forward? And I think Kelly and her team, working with, again, partners like the Community Foundation, so many others, have made sure that we could get this conversation out there, be humble, and be a part of listening to each other like we never have before. I also want to thank Dominion Energy. They've been just a phenomenal sponsor of the series, but really so many things that not only what we do, but what this community does. We appreciate Dominion for making that possible. The idea of the summit was to ground our community, understanding our checkered history. We've done that. To have an honest, authentic conversation and discussion about our opportunities and our challenges, and I think we accomplished that. And to think deeply about the actions that will yield new, more positive outcomes, for all of our residents to thrive. as individuals, as a chamber, and as a community. You know, the holidays are a time we naturally give thanks for what matters to us. And going into next week and the end of this year, I hope these conversations are giving others the same thoughts they're giving me, as I've got a lot to think about. Hope you also will take time to think about what you heard and have learned in these conversations and what you can do individually and collectively to influence us as we all move forward. Let's close out this conversation by talking about what happens next. And we need to remain seriously committed to continuing these conversations and this hard work, and to do so together. Our team is working to synthesize the key learnings, the suggested actions and resources that have been shared through the series by you and our speakers, and we'll share those back to you in a post-program guide in a few weeks' time. We will also share these with the Chamber's DE&I task force, which has worked very hard this summer, and we'll make sure that they'll have this information as they explore the issues they're working on and the other issues brought up during the series. And also the role of the Chamber as we go forth in addressing these issues. We'll do so in tandem with our Summit Series partners and with so many others that are working beside us in this work. And with those aligned community groups and leaders who've not been involved so far. We tried to be as inclusive and outreach to as many as we could, but we also know there's hundreds, if not thousands, of other voices that we need to make sure that we're talking to and listening to as we go forward. You know, in early 2021, we'd like to reconvene all of you, remembering that our session on philanthropic measures, Mark Kramer told us about the power of collective impact and the importance of a common agenda to make that possible. We hope and think that as we engage more leaders and members of our community for additional input, we might be able to work towards some common goals and a common agenda. Establishing trust, clarity of purpose, focus, and measuring progress will be key to making headway on becoming the community and the region that we all aspire to be. I thank you for being here. I thank you for listening with big ears and open hearts, and for thinking very deeply about what you and your organizations can do to help us achieve a more equitable and inclusive region. We can do this. We will do this. I wish you all a safe, enjoyable, and peaceful holiday season, and we look forward to more conversations in the new year. Take care.